is certainly we had gotten feedback as part of our outreach effort, if memory serves, that that highlighted to us a concern as to whether this was a change or this wasn't a change. And so that's why we're talking about it.
Mark, you had your plate up before.
This is maybe fast-forwarding a little bit to this afternoon's topic with technology. But the issue Ted raised about repeating an entire lease footnote in a quarterly filing kind of set off some bells for me. And thinking about how information is consumed by users and the technology tools that are used, and one of the key technology tools used is a blacklining tool, where an investor will use a blacklining tool to compare this K, or this Q to the last Q. And if you materially modify disclosures that are unchanged because one little piece of information changed, and it causes the whole footnote then to appear red because something changed, it makes it hard for the investor to find that nugget of key information about what changed. So when you think about presenting this material new information, you need to think about it in terms of how the information is going to be consumed, and making sure that the tools that are being used to consume that information are highlighting what is new and important and not highlighting that which is not changed.
That's an interesting challenge. Christine.
I just wanted to also add some comments to Amy's point earlier. So I agree with everything my fellow board members said, and also because I was concerned that there might be a hole created in terms of a catch-all if there is something significant that changed, I really felt like I needed that language added in order for me to be comfortable either removing items from the list that is currently required or feeling comfortable deciding not to add other things to the list that might not already be there. And so that's why I felt supportive of this change.
Can I ask a follow-up to Mark?
Sure.
On that? So that's one of the tension points that we have in talking about what gets explicitly required at quarters. We thought there would be a benefit to perhaps only providing certain disclosures, and this might creep into some of our other questions that we have. There might be a benefit to providing only portions of some disclosures because they've changed significantly. For the very reason that you highlighted, that it shows that numbers in a table, they all could change a little bit. But if we do the significant event that has a material effect on the entity, you might only get 2 lines disclosed in the quarter, and those are the 2 big ones to pay attention to. So I think that's consistent with what you're saying is, well, the tools that we're using, that would appear red, and now I can know that these are the things to pay attention to without having any noise. We get very different comments, and for any other users in the room, it'd be helpful to hear from you. We get other comments that say, no, just give me it all. And yes, numbers will always appear red, but I'll work out which ones are the important reds and which ones aren't. So if you want to talk about, because we hear both, and it gets hard for us to balance that.
Yeah, I think this goes a little bit to separating the idea of data versus disclosure. Numbers are always going to change, and numbers that are being routinely provided in a quarter, will get scraped into models to the extent those investors have set up a mechanism and a need to scrape those numbers into models. It's more of the words that are what is being picked up with tools like blacklining.
Okay, that's helpful.
Amy?
So just an observation that one of the objectives of the new words were to help figure out that there could be things that you could not include anymore. And when I read the words, I don't get that. I get the high-level principle that says disclose everything that's material. That makes sense. And then it says at a minimum, you have to disclose this list. So, but it doesn't say that you don't have to disclose the list if it's not material, or at least that's not the way I read it. So I'm not sure you're achieving the objective given the way you've written it.
I'm sorry. David?
I had the same reaction that Amy just mentioned, and would take it just a step further, because I think there's that question, in that minimum list, whether that's material items or material changes since the annual report. So something could be on this list and still be material, but if it hasn't materially changed, is it required to be disclosed in the interim financial information?
It's interesting, and I'll jump in here in terms of the questions both of you are raising, because I hadn't reviewed this required list, minimum list, for quite some time, and when I went through it, I had two reactions, somewhat different from yours. And there are a number of the items in here where it says significant. So if there is a significant change, then you have to include it. So for those items, and Nick, come back to me on this, I inferred that if there's not a significant change for those items on the minimum list, you don't have to disclose it. Now, there's a lot of others that don't have the word significant in front of it, and I think that's what you're referring to. Just to clarify, as to whether or not significant applies to all of this, or whether this is absolute minimum requirements.
So sometimes what we intend might not come through. And again, by the way, this is staff drafting. The board hasn't seen any of this language. We're kind of trying to refine this so what we bring to the board will work the way that we're thinking it should. What was taken out of the back half of 50-1 and was added to 50-1 AA was the intent was to do the thing that you are referring to. We took out the language as a minimum, so that no longer appears, because we've understood from outreach over the years that the minute you see that wording, regardless of whether that's what was intended when it was written, the minute you see that wording, we're putting that disclosure in. I as a preparer, did it that way. If I saw it as a minimum, I'm just going to do it every period. We highlighted that, to assess we tried to, assessing whether the disclosures are material, meaning they make a difference, involves considering the information provided at the previous year end in conjunction with the financial statements that we're giving this year. So what we meant there was, so if you could read last year's annual and the financial statements of this year, had there been enough changes to then disclose again at the quarter what follows on the list? That's what we meant. If there's a better way to tie that together, that'd be helpful.
Well, and there may be. I'm not sure I have a better way, but I think there may be a way to describe that. And one of the examples I thought about is derivative disclosures. There are a lot of them. If a company's derivative holdings haven't changed much, or maybe haven't changed at all, and everything, do they still need to do all of those disclosures because they're material, and the numbers are material, or could they elect to not? So I think that part of that is wording it in a way that if those 3 pages haven't really changed that much, maybe we don't need to bulk up the interim disclosures with it again.
Nick, just a quick comment. I'm not sure that, and I know you don't want to wordsmith a document, but you read the first sentence of paragraph AA. But if you read the second sentence, it reads, if publicly traded companies report summarized financial information at interim dates, including reports on fourth quarters, the following data should be reported. And it doesn't include, I think, what you were implying previously. Just a thought.
I think the ordering, it's a funny thing. The ordering, I think if we said that first piece and then with a parenthetical, that brought that first sentence down, it might have been clear. Yeah.
Yep.
No, that's fair.
Okay, I think Zach is next.
So I just wanted to say a couple things. I have a little bit different take from an investor perspective than Mark on the data. So we use blacklining as part of our manual process, which is really important. So we share that feedback. But we also use a lot of data integration. And so we automate a lot of what we do in terms of pulling numbers out of filings, and that's only growing. So there's a big cost to irregular data for us. So if something is provided on a one-off basis and then goes away, it becomes more difficult to bring it in. So in the example of XBRL, if you have nice structured data, it comes in every quarter. If it's irregular, you have a mess that requires manual intervention and knowing it exists, which is the hard part to automate. So there's a significant cost to that. I think when I looked at this, I went back to the disclosure framework that the FASB put together, and it was very clear that there's a benefit to technology in terms of the ability of users to consume, which I would absolutely agree with, and there's lower technological costs. But when you create just the materiality threshold and do sporadic disclosures, you lose that technological cost benefit of being able to produce it. So I would sort of challenge the FASB that to the extent we can continue to produce things on a regular basis and just make it part of our systems, there's a huge benefit to users. To having that as data versus analysis you have to go in and do manually, because it's not like our budgets keep growing every year, as I like to remind people. The other thing is on the materiality threshold. As users, we tend to view materiality a little bit differently than preparers. And I think one of the keys I wanted to put in there is that we view materiality on a quarterly basis as well as annual. So if something is material to the quarter, we want to know about it. That's very important because we are trend followers. We look at what the trend is, and if it changes, if it stays the same, but there's a reason it stays the same, that's exactly the information we need. So when I discussed this with a lot of our analysts, one of the things they said was, we need to know if there's significant concentration of revenue that occurs in a single quarter. That's important information that investors have to know, and it's only available in the annual disclosures. So those would be the two things I would interject.
Thanks, Zach. I think Karen, I'm going to apologize in advance. A lot of nameplates went up essentially at the same time, so if I don't have the perfect order, permit me. Karen, I know you're next. Thank you. Cindy, I think you're next.
Maybe making an obvious point, but I'm feeling protective of corporate accounting and FP&A departments, and the amount of variance in interpretation in this room is going to be multiplied a lot outside of this room, and I just think the more directive and clear and concise this can be, the better, because when you use terms like material and significant, you're kicking off all kinds of discussions in corporate rooms around the nation of what the heck that means and who decides that and how you interpret that. And I just think it creates a lot of angst and work that more than you may think.
Okay, here's the touchdown.
So perhaps rather than focus on the words, maybe we can talk about it at a high level, and what we're trying to make sure we can confirm is the philosophical thing, and just to kind of compare and contrast what Ted and Zach said. So historically, interim reporting has been a red flag approach. You have the annual. We let management observe the red flag approach. Ted likes that. Zach, I think, is saying give it all the same, and you will use your tools to determine the red flag approach and what's meaningful to you. At the macro level, that's fair. So there's three things you could have. You could either say we're all going to have the same, and let technology highlight to the investor where there's a change, and they judge if they think that change changes their analysis or not. Or you have the pure management red flag approach where you only talk about changes. But what we have today is an in-between approach. We have a red flag approach except for the following 15 items. So the board needs to figure out, do we want to do all the same or a pure red flag approach, or if we're in the middle, where do we want to identify the requirements? So one of the things I think we ought to focus on is the requirements when we talk about a material change, is it transactional only or transactional and